Hello and welcome to another episode of Chai, Children of Adam and Eve on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan of Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue during the month of Ramadan, where we will discuss research relevant to our lives today. Professor Max Oidtmann teaches Chinese history at Georgetown University, Qatar. He is a linguist par excellence, mastered, as I would claim, but he might be more humble about it, several Eastern languages including Chinese, Tibetan, Uyghur, Manchu and Japanese. His publications are available on academia.edu, and his forthcoming publications, Forging the Golden Horn, The Politics of Reincarnation in China, and Between Patron and Priest, are due to be published very soon. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us today, Professor Max.
Thanks for having me.
Can we begin with your interest in the Chinese administration, in which period, and how do you understand them as colonial?
Well, first of all, to begin with, let's clarify what we're talking about. So, Qing Dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty in China, governing China from about 1644 to 1912. The last Qing monarch abdicated in 1912, after which the Qing Dynasty was replaced by China's first attempt at a republic, which lasted really for only a couple years before it devolved into a series of warlord states, which was finally reunited in 1949 by the Communist Party, the People's Republic of China. So my research is really begins with the present day, actually, not so much with the Qing Dynasty, because I've for a number of years now, and since I began working in China, I've been concerned primarily with the history of ethnic relations in China, which have become the issue of ethnic relations in China has become quite a bit more salient in the last couple of years, especially since 2008 and 2009, where there were major protests in first Lhasa and then in Urumqi, which is the capital of the Uyghur Autonomous Region. Protests involving many thousands of people, resulting in large numbers of casualties, and really reminding everyone, both abroad and within China, that China was very much a place that had not solved some of the ethnic tensions which were long-term legacies, actually, of the imperial period. So my own research and interest in the region began well before these recent incidents, but I'm particularly concerned with trying to explain their deeper origins.
So how do you differentiate between what is often described as an empire, or history of empire, and your categorization of the Qing Dynasty as colonial?
Well, I would put it this way. In my opinion, I don't want to over-fetishize the term colonialism. In some respects, my use of the term differs a little bit from some other modern historians, but I see colonialism as something which is not particularly unique to European powers. From my perspective, colonialism is the set of practices and technologies, policies, which are implemented to maintain an imperial form of rule. And so by this definition, places as diverse as Japan, China, and of course France, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on, and England par excellence, the example of a colonial empire, all can be, and broadly speaking, are comparable types of systems. So it's been really common, especially since for much of the 20th century, less so recently, but to think of China as some particularly unique political formation, whose size and scope is very, very different, has a very, very different explanation than the ways in which we understand the scale of, say, the British Empire. Chinese nationalists, in particular, beginning in the really around the turn of the 19th century, in an attempt to make modern China's boundaries seem really, really normal, tried to argue that China had always had a very, very unique history, in which the culture of China had inspired either immigration or voluntary inclusion within China by the various peoples and polities that circulated around the perimeter. So in a way, trying to say that, look, China is very, very large, and it's this size not through conquest, but through a kind of voluntary assimilation. And in this respect, they've done a pretty good job very much so within China, of persuading people that China's contemporary size and scope is a very natural and peaceful enterprise. But one of the things, so in my own personal research, I'm interested in exploring the fact, the problematic fact that that transition from the Qing Empire into a modern nation state was actually much more traumatic, much more problematic, and actually conceptually quite difficult, even for Chinese nationalists. So the fact that the contemporary Chinese state has managed to hold on to the territories of the Great Qing Empire is a pretty remarkable thing, and it requires a great degree of historical explanation.
Would you consider the comparison with, say, the Ottoman Empire at the time, which is also crumbling during the same period as the Qing dynasty transforms into China, into the Republic of China? Would you say that the Turkish Republic was also inheriting a colonial model of an Ottoman polity?
My history of the Turkish state after the fall of the Ottoman Empire is a bit rusty, and I'm not sure if I would necessarily call the modern Turkish state colonial. But what's really interesting is that putting the Qing dynasty side by side with the Ottoman Empire is actually a wonderful comparison. And one of the really stark differences that sort of might inspire further research is the fact that Ataturk and other Turkish nationalists in the early 20th century made, by comparison, what seems to be a really, really stark decision. So unlike Chinese nationalists beginning in the late 1800s and in the early 20th century, very much unlike Chinese nationalists, Turkish nationalists decided to basically rid themselves of those Ottoman territories, which did not seem to them to be very representative of a modern Turkish state. So Ataturk
Or they were removed by
other powers, right?
Yeah.
But whether or not it was of their own volition or through the action of outside powers, contemporary or modern Turkish nationalism tried to construct a modern Turkish state, around this new idea of a Turk identity, right? A state which was at least in the imagination of these nationalists, unified by language, by race, by culture, and Armenians and Kurds and so on didn't necessarily fit in that picture, but hopefully would be either removed or assimilated. The Chinese vision, or the Chinese nationalist vision, which emerges from the shattered detritus of the Qing Empire in the 1890s and early 20th century, tried to do something very, very different. Although there was a certain and very vocal segment of Chinese nationalists who said, we don't need these non-Chinese territories within the Qing Empire. We don't, for instance, we have no particular connection to Tibet. We have no deep racial connection with the Mongols or the Turks or the other Muslim groups of the far west. And therefore, we should reconstruct our modern race-based Chinese nation state on those core territories of the ancient or the older Ming Empire. So the original 18 provinces, which in a very colloquial way people refer to as China. But as the Qing dynasty began to fall, there were a number of other nationalists, many of whom had shared that initial sort of very exclusionary, racist version of a Chinese future. But there emerged a new consensus that if this Chinese state was going to survive, it wasn't enough simply to include the old Ming territories, but ideally the new nation state of China would include the regions that had been conquered and incorporated into the Great Qing dynasty. So Tibet, Mongolia, Xinjiang or Eastern Turkestan are the most important places. And so their maps, the maps that these Chinese nationalists drew, and the claims that they made when the last Qing emperor abdicated, included all these regions. The problem, of course, is that they had to do something very difficult, which was to persuade both ethnic Chinese within China proper and Tibetans, Uyghurs, Muslims, and Mongols that they all somehow belonged organically to this new Chinese nation. And so they had to do quite a bit of linguistic gymnastics and invent almost an entire new vocabulary for the modern Chinese state. And this was not seamless. It was, in fact, very, very difficult. And although it must be said they've managed to persuade most Chinese-speaking, what you might consider ethnically Chinese members of the modern Chinese polity, that this is a natural thing, that the modern Chinese state should in fact include all these diverse places and peoples. From the perspective of the periphery, from the perspective of Tibetans, Muslims, Mongols, and so on, the arguments and the new language made by modern Chinese nationalists has not been that persuasive.
And again, the comparison goes across to the Turkic regions, because Armenians and Kurdish people also have found difficulty in assimilating the Turkic nationalist views of an attempt at inclusivism. So would you allow me to say that that the Tibetan relations with the Qing administrators would be your primary interest in ethnic relations, to have the perspective of the Tibetan people as opposed to the colonial administrators in your attempt at trying to tell us a story of that period?
So what my current research is primarily trying to do is investigate, well, how was it that the Qing dynasty was actually able to incorporate and govern these very diverse, very different regions for such a long period of time? So from the perspective of the Qing state, from the Qing emperors, when it comes to Tibet, in their own internal communications with each other, that is to say, the letters that pass between the emperor and his colonial officials or his inner court officials in Beijing, they really believed that their control of Tibet, that sovereignty over Tibet, had really only been acquired in the 1790s. So it must be said that from the 1790s well until 1912, the Qing dynasty governed Tibet, or Tibetan regions, in a variety of different ways, but it was a fairly durable form of governance. So that behooves us to sort of to ask the question, well, how did they do it? The government of China during the Qing dynasty were themselves a conquest elite. They were not, in fact, Chinese. They didn't speak Chinese when they first arrived in China. Culture was very, very different. This was a group now known as the Manchus, the Manchu people, who had created their own very new state to the northeast of the Ming dynasty in the early 1600s. They conquered China in the 1640s and 1650s, and then using the industrial, the agricultural superiority of the Chinese polity, they were able to go on launch an enterprise of conquest, which ultimately included huge swaths of Eurasia. So by the 1750s, over a course of treaties, the Great Qing dynasty and their Manchu rulers had formulated a number of agreements, come to a number of agreements with the Russian Empire, which basically divided all of Eurasia between these two growing empires. And from the 1750s on, Central Asia would gradually fall under the control either of the Russian Empire or of the Qing Empire. But that process of inclusion, of building a colonial administration, was never easy. In Tibet, it was perhaps a little bit more easy, straightforward, because the Qing Empire, the Qing rulers had some familiarity with Tibetan Buddhism, and along with their Mongol allies, they had for centuries been engaged in practices of sponsoring Tibetan monasteries, and they could sort of talk the talk when it came to governing Tibet. But when it came to governing an even vaster region of Central Asia, where the indigenous population was Muslim, groups of people that spoke Turkic languages, associated themselves with a variety of different Sufi solidarities, who had a rich manuscript culture in Arabic and Persian, they found themselves in a much more difficult position. They didn't speak that language yet. They didn't have a way of positioning themselves within the cultural hierarchy of Islamic regions. And so, again, it was a challenge, but it must be said, it's quite remarkable that the Qing dynasty was able to govern in a relatively stable fashion this huge section of Central Asia, well, from the 1750s all the way down until 1912.
Do you compare at all British colonial administration might have had with the South Asian or Indian, at that time, Muslim peoples? and Hindu religion as such.
Definitely, definitely.
And how the Qing were doing similar things, or earlier or later, perhaps.
What's just in terms of a interesting historical coincidence is the fact that the Qing dynasty defeated the last major indigenous rulers of Central Asia at precisely the same time, and actually the very same year, as the British defeated the last independent Nawab or ruler, post or late Mughal ruler in northern India. That's in 1757.
Okay.
Right, I believe it was the Nawab of Bengal. In 1757, we're talking still about the great East India Company, whose semi-private military forces in collaboration with a variety of other local players defeat some of these last Mughal rulers and assert their dominance over that wonderfully prosperous region of north central India. But of course, as I mentioned, where I was starting this thought was with the coincidence that the Qing and the British East India Company are having this achievement at about the same time. But what gets more interesting is actually looking more carefully, when you look more carefully at the legal culture created by both of these empires. And in many respects, looking at over the long term at the ways in which colonial Indian legal culture was established and transformed, and comparing that to the way that colonial legal culture was established and transformed in the Great Qing Empire, one notices a lot of similarities. In both cases, colonial rulers found it necessary to sanction and tolerate indigenous forms of jurisprudence. So the British found themselves sanctioning and tolerating Hindu and Muslim courts, much as the Qing dynasty found itself establishing Muslim and Tibetan or Mongolian courts in their scattered territories, in their outer territories.
You are listening to Chai, Children of Adam and Eve, on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan, where we are discussing today Chinese-Tibetan relations and Chinese history in general with Professor Max Oidtmann. Sanctioning and tolerating legal cultures, indigenous legal cultures, is that a way that British legal historians, legal historians of British India would conceptualize the relations, do you think, or would they couch it in other terms? Or is that a comparative vocabulary that you would develop for these two imperial practices in relation to law?
My sense, from being an armchair historian of British India, is that they would use those words.
Okay.
But they might even go a step further and use an even stronger word, which would be that the British colonial legal order didn't simply tolerate indigenous forms and traditions of jurisprudence, but actually played a major role in transforming them, perhaps even inventing them. And the situation was remarkably similar in the Qing case. And I can offer what I think is quite an amusing example, which is in the 1730s, when the Qing dynasty began to extend its control over northern Tibet, a part of Tibet known to Tibetans as Amdo, which in fact is the place where the current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama's home is. When the Qing dynasty began to incorporate this region, they quite quickly decided that they needed to have a set of legal codes which were appropriate for the region. But they didn't know that much about the Tibetan legal system. And so when we look at the archives, the archive discussions among the Qing colonial officials, most of whom were military officials who were sent into this region, you find them discussing, well, what to do about this local legal system, what should be the basis of this legal order. And what they ultimately did was take a set of legal codes from Mongolia, bring them to Tibet, and then relabel them the Tibetan codes. So they made some small changes. For instance, they recognized that in the Tibetan economic system, yaks, that is to say cows that can handle high altitude terrain, were more central to the economy, and so they substituted yaks for horses in a lot of the different statutes. But by and large, they pretty much took a Mongol code, exported it to a Tibetan region, relabeled it Tibetan, and that code, strangely enough, formed the basis of what ultimately became called the traditional Tibetan legal order. It interacted in dynamic ways with indigenous legal traditions, and over the next 150 years, of course, became something quite different. But I think it's very, very interesting to observe the degree to which the Great Qing colonial legal order and the Great British Empire both had a pretty profound and transformative influence on indigenous legal culture. From what I've read about the history of colonial jurisprudence and practices, that is, legal culture in colonial India, that the British brought with them, of course, a lot of Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment era assumptions about how law should work, assumptions about commercial law being different from criminal law, assumptions about what the kind of place and role that religious law should have. And they certainly reified and objectified these things and tried to establish boundaries between perhaps a legal culture which was much more holistic in its original form. But it's difficult even to say what was an original form of Islamic jurisprudence, because these things were, of course, always a work in progress. The refreshing thing about the history of Islamic regions is, of course, the degree to which it was always a tradition which was open for discussion. Different jurists, different traditions of jurisprudence were always a major part of the social fabric. People could, for instance, forum shop, as we call, right? They could seek out different judges, different qazi, different locations in order to pursue favorable decisions. And people certainly did that within the Qing Empire as well.
So was there if you'll allow me the term, a Qing Orientalist tradition of Tibet study?
Very much so. I like your choice of phrasing there. In the early decades of the Qing Empire, most of the people who were engaged in colonial administration were drawn from the conquest elite. That was from the Manchu people or their Mongol allies. And these were people who, even before the creation of the Great Qing state, had been intermarried with Tibetans and other Mongol groups, and were quite familiar with Mongol history, Tibetan history, and of course with Tibetan Buddhism. But in the mid-Qing, beginning in the 1780s and the 1790s, knowledge about the outer regions began to trickle into the general elite Chinese population. So this is a group of people we generally in Chinese studies refer to as the literati, the scholar elite or the scholar officials, men who had passed the lower stages or intermediate stages of the exam system, and people who had a training in Confucian studies and Confucian governance. And this group of people had, for the first century of the Qing Empire, been really cut off from the frontiers. These were people who had been delegated to stay in charge of China proper. But in the 1780s and 90s, they began to sort of discover for themselves these new territories and began to produce precisely the kind of information you hint at when you talk about a kind of Orientalism. So they began to produce images, maps, travel logs, gazetteers, historical chronicles, which portrayed the frontier people in ways which made the conquest of these regions and the ongoing administration of these regions seem pretty normal.
A last question regarding this particular aspect of your study: is it possible for a historian to any way get access to the views that Tibetan monks or ordinary people might have, historically speaking? Is there any records, or would there be any archives which can be accessed for a Tibetan view on this period of history?
One of the wonderful things about Tibetan studies is that we're blessed with an extremely rich written tradition. And this is despite the fact that so much of it was destroyed in the 1950s and 1960s. For instance, just to begin by answering a question with one small fact, which is quite surprising, is that rates of literacy, as far as we can tell, rates of literacy even in nomadic regions of Tibet were actually higher than neighboring regions of China proper. And the system of mass monasticism, this network of large-scale monasteries which often had 3,000 to 5,000, at times even as many as 10,000 monks in them, were conceptualized by Tibetans themselves as monastic universities. They were composed of numerous sub-colleges. People traveled from all across Tibet to these different institutions to learn, of course, Buddhist philosophy, to learn history, to learn rhetoric, learn a variety of practices which they could take home to their home communities to enhance the spread of Buddhism. But these people were extraordinarily literate. Of course, wasn't universal. I mean, many of the monks at these mass monasteries were not particularly well educated. They were engaged as cooks and even farmers and other things. But the system did support a considerable output of printed material, books, both in sort of manuscript form and in printed form.
So the Chinese hold these archives, or the Tibetan region has?
So these, and of course, just to add to this, so there's this huge literary and cultural production, and of course the monasteries and the government of Tibet maintain their own rich archives of official documents, legal texts and all sorts of things. And a lot of these books were brought overseas into India first and then spread around the world in the 1950s and 60s. So we actually have pretty good access to Tibetan sources. And in the 1800s in particular, Tibetans really got interested in their own history. Well before the rise of modern nationalism, Tibetans were writing local histories, regional histories, and things that look a lot like national histories. And we can go back to those sources, those texts, and get a pretty good idea of, well, what did the Tibetans think about being ruled by China, and what was their view of the wider world? One of the interesting things, which certainly people in mainland China tend to forget, is that one of the first global atlases or global geographies ever produced in the Qing Empire was not produced by a Han literati or a Han Chinese person in China proper, but was in fact produced by a Tibetan monk. And this was in the 1820s. In fact, 10 to 15 years before the first major global atlas would be produced by a Chinese author. So the Qing dynasty had access to all sorts of information, but it's hidden from view largely because historians have been prejudiced towards reading the Chinese archives and have tended to forget that the Qing Empire was a very multicultural place. It was a conquest dynasty, and they produced enormous quantities of information in non-Chinese languages. And so if we really want to understand how the Qing saw the world and how they ran their empire, we need to read the Manchu language archives, we need to read the Turkic language archives, we need to look at the Tibetan archives.
And with that, we'll ask the last question, which is related to this, which is, how do you see the future growth of this somewhat, I would say, neglected region and period in world history, where people often approach this area within a Buddhist paradigm? And I think through this conversation you've made us realize that it is comparative in all its aspects to the British, at least the Ottoman, the British comparatives can be easily drawn. And how do you see the future progress of comparative history in relation to Tibetan history?
So, I mean, I'll answer the question in two ways. First, just within the field of China studies, there's been a growing consensus in the last decade, primarily among China scholars who are from places outside of China, that in order to understand the basic question of why is China so big, we really need to think again about the Great Qing Empire, and particularly begin to learn the languages that the Qing Empire used to rule its vast territory. And interestingly enough, in the last 1 or 2 years, even Chinese scholars have begun getting on that bandwagon. For them it's more problematic, it's more sensitive, primarily because if you're Chinese or a Chinese scholar and you suddenly label the Great Qing an empire, either implicitly or explicitly say, this is something we can compare with British or French or Japanese colonialism, then you do something perhaps slightly dangerous. You say, are the territories of the modern Chinese state type of control entirely legitimate? And that comparison is certainly something which challenges and threatens Chinese intellectuals and the Chinese state. In the second respect, because the study of Chinese history is becoming much more sophisticated and a lot more overtly comparative, we're beginning to put our research in much more direct conversation with French and British historians. And I think that what this is going to do is really answer some basic questions which people have asked but only addressed by using British or French examples. Is there something unique about modernity that we find only in the British, French or Russian empires? And I think that what we're beginning to find is that certain practices of building a modern state, which we think of as uniquely European, in fact had, if not parallel processes of development, were perhaps deeply interlinked.
And with that, we'd have to end. Of course, it would be lovely to continue this conversation, perhaps on other fronts like economic institution building, a comparison between Mughal and Qing and Ming dynasties, but we're out of time, and hopefully we'll get another opportunity to talk further. Thank you so much for your time today, and we wish our listeners Ramadan Kareem. If you would like to wish our listeners as well.
Yes, I wish them, the listeners as well, a very pleasant Ramadan. And I thank the interviewer for bringing me here today, and I look forward to conversations in the future.
Thank you, and please stay tuned to our next program in this series. A special thanks to Ehab al-Sheikh for bringing this program to you.